Welcome to Australian Fairy Tales, the podcast. The Australian Fairy Tale Society delights in taking a deep dive through time, culture, and language to explore fairy tales from an Australian perspective and discover what flesh they wear today. Through this podcast, you'll meet some of our fairy tale enthusiasts. G'day, I'm your host, Alexandra McCullum, and it's my pleasure to welcome our guest, Pam Blamey. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders, past, present, and emerging, on the land in which I stand, which is the Jagera Turrbal people in Brisbane. I acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which our listeners stand and extend a warm welcome to those of you in your countries. Today, our guest is Pam Blamey. It's the irrationality of fairy tales and their possibilities rather than the facts which appeal to Pam, who's a retired counsellor, art therapist, and member of the C.G. Jung Society of Queensland. As Pam's passion for fairy tales goes beyond happily ever after to the way their symbols and metaphors nourish the soul, she became a founding member of the Australian Fairy Tale Society and has been both Society Secretary and Brisbane Ring Maiden. She is presenting at our conference on the topic Fossicking in Fairy Tales, a Jungian sifter for gems in the psyche. Welcome, Pam. Can you tell me about your involvement with stories? What is it that interests you the most?
Sure, and thanks for having me, Alex. And I'd like to acknowledge the Jagera and Turrbal people to Mianjin, where I am. So, childhood books started me off, given to me by an aunt and a godmother. And the Arthur Rackham illustrations terrified me. Every time we went for a walk on the farm, I would see trees gnarling at me and, faces, and it was very interesting. And then as a mature age student, I went to university and was introduced to C.G. Jung and Joseph Campbell. And then I discovered that there was a Jung Society in Brisbane, and I joined in about 1993 or 1994. And I had to put blinkers on so that because I had to do other assignments. However, a few years went by, and then a friend lent me a book called Once Upon a Midlife by Alan B. Chinnan. And I was hooked because of the Jungian commentary on the stories. And so since then, I have run a few workshops and given a few talks over the years, delving into fairy tales, such as The Ugly Duckling, Rapunzel, The Golden Key, The Queen Bee, Cinderella, and Nixie in the Mill Pond. Around 2011, I started a website and podcast where I read aloud stories. I didn't tell them, I read them. 14 of them, and that lasted for about 10 years, but marketing isn't my forte, so nothing really happened with that podcast and website, and I took it all down at the beginning of this year. And I was absolutely thrilled in my final art therapy year to discover that the Fairy Tale Society in Australia had started in 2013. And as you say, I was secretary for a couple of years and ran the Fairy Tale Ring and was very happy to hand it over to Catherine Gosso. In 2016, I took a trip to Portugal for the second International Storytelling and Fairy Tale Therapy Seminar, which was just amazing. I met some incredible fairy tale aficionados and storytellers there. And I've also been involved in the story conferences, which were run by Andrew Rickson. And I've published a chapter in each, or a contribution in each of his 3 books that they've published about storytelling and, tools for storytelling. So what really excites me about fairy tales and there's the symbolism and the wisdom that comes about the human condition, because they're so ancient. You know, some of them are thousands of years old, and so the human nature hasn't changed much in that time, really. Culture has changed, but not human nature.
Excellent. It's really interesting. Can you tell me about a time you saw the power of stories in your work?
Yes, two things come to mind. The first is I was invited by a colleague, Florence E., who is an interactive drawing therapy practitioner, and she invited me to give a workshop with her about, using story. So I chose The Golden Key, which is one of the Grimm stories. I think it's the shortest story. And I supplied the materials for the participants to make a little cask. And then I asked them to draw a very big keyhole and to draw how they could see their lives ahead through this keyhole, and maybe make some notes on the outside of what barriers or options they had. And I just loved that workshop because it was so wonderful to see the participants so totally focused on what they were doing, and then in the sharing how the insights had come to them from that. So that was my favorite workshop, I think. Another time I was the resident storyteller with the EEC, the Ethnic Communities Council of Queensland. And we did a series of talks, and then went away on a camp at Maroochydore with some Islamic women. And it was great to choose stories to go with the topics. And then we went away to Maroochydore for a camp, and I used the 6-part story method, which draws on Marie-Louise France's work, for them to make the 6-part story method is a sort of skeleton for people to make up their own stories. And that was such fun to watch them drawing their little picture in pictorial fashion, their story in the 6 parts. And then in the evening when we shared the story, I told the story of stone soup, and they came up with their own stories from their own culture around that theme. And it was just such fun. Such fun. Yeah.
I'm really interested in this idea about irrationality of fairy tales. Can you expand on that a little bit more and tell me why you think it's useful?
Well, it's the magical part of fairy tales. In fairy tales and in dreams, the physics and time don't matter. Water can run uphill type of thing. And so that frees up the imagination, I think, to, anything can happen. What if? Yeah.
Yeah, it's similar to what you were saying about the drawing a keyhole activity, the imagination of having that keyhole in front of your eye. And then, we all think about what's going to happen in the future all the time and what our options are and what the best path forward is. But sometimes we think about things in the same way every time. So what strikes me about that keyhole activity is you provided a way for people to open up their thinking by adding that imaginative element to the activity, which is really interesting. Yeah. So this October you'll be presenting at our annual conference, which is considering the theme Australian fairy tales, flesh or fossil. What interests you most about this theme, and does it connect with your presentation?
Well, yes, I when I saw the theme, I thought, oh, yes, that appeals. I'll put my hand up to give a paper, although I'm retired now.
Oh, come on, you're not really
Well,
retired.
I'm retired from work, but not from fairy tales. I don't think I'll ever be retired from fairy tales. But over the years, I've learned more and more about the symbolism in mythology and fairy tales, and wanted to delve deeper and deeper. And as I've done, courses online and delve deeper into the Jungian way of doing it, it's really, I want to just learn more and more.
Mm.
And listening to Lorena Carrington's interview on this podcast series, where she was talking about how the silhouette, when she photographs, they become silhouettes, and they could be about anybody. They're not a photograph of a specific person.
Mm.
And that really appealed to me, because that fits very well with the idea of a fairy tale being a story. The whole story is about a single psyche, single personality that could be anyone.
Mm. Mm.
And I'm not a particularly literary person. I prefer nonfiction to fiction, would you believe? Except for fairy tales. But so I think it's good to inspire the new stories and to keep them alive. I mean, I don't particularly like Disney's story, but at least they're keeping the stories alive, and then people can delve into the real story behind the Disney Fantasyland story later. So it's important to keep, I think it's important not to lose the essence of the stories, because they're so old and are so rich. And there are treasures in the fossil record.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's not surprising that you were interested in that particular framing of our conference topic. Thank you. I'm your podcast host, Alexandra McCallum, and I've been talking with Pam Blamey. If you're interested in hearing more, all fairy tale enthusiasts are welcome to attend a fairy tale ring, either online or in their state, or you can attend our Brisbane conference on the 1st and the 2nd of October 2022. So please get in touch, and we look forward to talking about more stories with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.